Welcome everyone to the Global Crisis Management module as part of your postgraduate programme. My name is John Connolly and I'm going to be the module leader and the key point of contact for the module for you for the rest of the semester. Um, Really, what I want to do here is to introduce you to some of the very basic themes and issues around the challenge of managing crises in a global context. That issue of the global context is very important because one of the main themes of the programme that you're studying is to think about internationalisation, think about global governance issues, and global crisis management is part of that activity and exercise. So, although it is useful to talk about national crises, it's useful more so to do so in the context of a global environment. And when we talk about a global environment, we're really interested in how international actors, institutions, agencies, organizations, leaders work together or otherwise to address complex, wicked problems. I use that term wicked problems in the sense that many issues in global crisis management are about managing things that are chronically difficult to see a way through. A wicked problem is something that is really intractable. It's unclear as to the one set of solutions for dealing with a wicked problem. And we see that in a global context in our present time. If you think about things like poverty, inequalities, issues to do with the climate, environment, and so on, these issues really do require cooperation at a global level. But they're also very challenging because of things like political relationships, things like having sometimes an unclear overview of how to wrestle with the problem, how to deal with the problem, how to define the problem, how to resource tackling it. So, global governance and wicked problems are key themes of this module. On top of all of that is the theme of globalization, about the interconnections between people, goods, information, the flow, interconnectivity of things around the globe really lead to what we could call a vulnerability problem. Vulnerability problem in the sense that the greater the interconnection of systems, the increased difficulties can emerge from when one problem happens in one part of the system in the sense that that can lead to ripple effects and failures in other parts of systems. So essentially, this theme of global governance, globalization, and wicked problems are kind of branches of the same tree, if you like, in this module. And what you will have the opportunity to do through the seminars is to engage with academic staff that are engaged with a number of issues to do with global governance using the lens of crisis management. This module is very much research underpinned, and you'll get the opportunity to meet with staff, including myself, who are undertaking work that fit within the parameters of the module that cross cut issues to do with health, the environment, health and addictions, issues to do with dementia, issues to do with the free movement of people, immigration, all of these different things are looked at in the module in different ways. And really, what we're trying to do as a team is to get students to engage with those different topics, but also to try and understand some of the parallels that underpin the different case studies that you'll see. Could there be things like issues to do with power, issues to do with inequality, corruption? Are there issues to do with not necessarily knowing the right solutions for dealing with problems? What's the best form of evidence for dealing with chronic issues in a global crisis management forum? So there's a number of issues that you'll come across in the module. So I'm looking forward to working with you Another point to make is that you will not be short of reading on this module. As you'll see from the top of the Moodle page, there is a list of sources for you to engage with that are grouped around crisis management themes. So, given the fact, obviously, this is a postgraduate program, postgraduate module, we do expect students to come to the sessions prepared, come to the sessions having read some material, and that material might not necessarily just be the academic literature, but it might also be things like governmental publications, think tank reports, other forms of publications that might be beyond the peer review journal articles and books, although it's very important to engage with those also. So that's in the Word document at the top of the middle page. If you have a look at that, that will give you a sense of the types of readings that we have on the module, and lots of those are accessible online in terms of e-journals, for example. But this fairly short recorded lecture is there really to introduce you to some of the key themes and issues that allow us to use as a springboard when we come to looking at the other topics later in the module. And I'll be elaborating on some of these themes next week when we look at multi-level governance and crisis management. As you can see from the slide, we're not short of crises that have international implications. As you can see from the representation of the credit cards there, that's supposed to represent the credit crunch. The credit crunch, the global financial crisis that had ripple effects for economies across the globe. Of course, we'll all understand the implications of that in terms of global recession and the lessons that policymakers might have to learn about the regulation of the banking industry, about how we actually manage the global economy. But the key point there is that the global financial crisis really reiterated to us the vulnerabilities that come from the interconnection of financial systems and information systems across the globe. One problem in one part of the world, in terms of the mortgage subprime market in America, had ripple effects for the rest of the world. So that's a very good example of the need for global governance around issues to do with economic crises. A question that that you might want to ponder is, to what extent have we learnt lessons from the global financial crisis? To what extent are global actors working together effectively enough to reduce the risk that this will happen again in the future? That's something for you to think about. Of course, represented on the slide also is the 9/11 terrorist atrocity in America. And what that showed was the vulnerabilities that come from issues to do with the use of transport, airlines as a tool to conduct acts of terrorism. Also, the interconnections between issues to do with foreign policy and the terrorist atrocities, issues to do with homeland security that were a key lesson learned after the 9/11 attacks, which have implications for how the US is governed now, but also set a precedent, if you like, for some of the narrative that we're seeing just now from the Trump administration in terms of thinking about becoming more protectionist when it comes to letting people from different countries into the country. So, really, what the 9/11 attacks did was kind of reorder and reconfigure the issue of global terror. And obviously, what happened after that was the so called war on terror as well, which had implications for the Middle East and US UK relations and so on. So we can see how this attack has had multiple and global implications. Another example on the slide here is from foot and mouth disease. I've done a lot of work looking at foot and mouth disease from a health security point of view, and one of the things that you'll find is that if there's an outbreak of something like foot and mouth in one country and you're a trading partner with another country, therefore what happens is that the outbreak will have implications for the economy in terms of the trade of certain products. It might be that, for example, when we had the foot and mouth crisis back in 2001 in the UK, that the European Union decides to implement restrictionist legislation on what you can and cannot do in the event of an outbreak. It might, the EU this is, they might implement new policy, introduce new policy for the crisis management of that issue across Europe, as they did do after 2001. And that was really because, in many ways, the UK was part of the European Union. And when you're part of a economic, social bloc, or you have a relationship at an economic level with another country, quite often what happens is that there is a need for cooperation and partnership working when it comes to dealing with outbreaks of disease that have a threat. And of course, that we saw that with the Ebola crisis, and that's represented by the individuals wearing the masks at the top right hand side of the screen. Basically, what you found there was the problem of Ebola in West Africa led to increased vulnerabilities for that society, but also the fact that globalization means that people travel, and there was obviously that risk that Ebola would spread between countries. Again, that's an issue of vulnerability, but from a global crisis management point of view, the issue of Ebola really helped us to kind of refocus what it is that the international global order should be doing about tackling these types of crises. For example, the World Health Organization was subjected to a number of criticisms for its sluggish role when it came to intervening to support the West Africans in their effort to crisis. And so that really got us to question the effectiveness of global crisis management actors. And that's something that you might want to think about when it comes to your own case studies, which you'll be allowed to look at within the assignment for this module. In the sense of to what extent are the global actors together, and how do we know? How can we measure that? Of course, there's other examples on the slide here. For example, in the centre of the slide, you can see the Paris shootings. Paris shootings obviously is a wider issue to do with global terror. We also have the Iraq mass destruction dossier there that indicates the ripple effect, if you like, of conflict and how that might have implications for different countries in terms of their relationships with each other and what they might actually do in the future. Will they cooperate on similar types of conflicts in the future as a result of the Iraq War? How will that reshape the political relationships that we see in the world? And of course, in recent times, we've seen extremely horrific outcomes of the UN, well, not the UN, but the refugee crisis, and the UN has had a key role in trying to deal with that. The refugee crisis being something that is very much related to issues to do with inequalities, poverty, and conflict, whereby, of course, you have Syrians as well coming into Europe. It's obviously had implications for a number of different countries, for example, Greece, Germany as well. Angela Merkel was criticised for taking in too many migrants into the country, and that did have some political implications for her government in recent times at the German elections. So we can see how these issues, and when you try and tackle them, there's often a real complexity with regards to how you do it, but they often have political implications. And that's something we need to think about also. Again, as you see in the slide, there's the obesity crisis noted here, and obviously that talks to a wider narrative to do with health and state of the world's health. And one of the things that globalization has helped to do in many ways is to advance and re-emphasize the movement of affordable products, but also things like junk foods, things like the role of multinational corporations who use advertising to try and target particular groups. It might be that those things have implications for health because people end up consuming the things that are promoted to them. And globalization cannot be necessarily removed from that issue. So we've got a number of different types of cases here on the slide. But one of the things that, or a couple of things we could say about these things is that they really do matter in terms of people's lives and in terms of how society is reshaped as a result of these events. But it also calls into question the politics of political order and the extent to which problems are being managed effectively or not. So when you're studying this module, a key aspect of your work is to think about issues to do with effectiveness. Think about the effectiveness of governmental actions to tackle problems. What are the lessons that can be drawn for countries, for states, for governments when it comes to how they have managed crises or how they have mismanaged crises. These are the things that we'll focus on very much with. Of course, that theme of politics is extremely important. The question, therefore, is what is political about crises? What makes them political? Well, it's fair to say that the literature is interested in thinking about the role of political actors, political leaders, political crisis managers, and how they respond to crises. There's a range of sources on the slide there that talk about this issue. But they also talk about this issue from the perspective of the governance regime that's doing the management of the crisis. So, what about the officials within the bureaucracy? What about civil servants? What is their key roles in the management of crises? How do those officials interface with politicians? Who ultimately should be accountable for the management of crisis? Should it be those officials working in bureaucracies, those officials working in ministries of government, or should it be the politicians that are held to account for the management of crises? Again, the politics of crisis management is also directly related to the ambitions and the intentions of government. It might be that some governments decide to invest in some areas of risk prevention over others. So, as we've seen recently, that Donald Trump is less inclined to focus on the environment, but is much more inclined to focus on things like the prevention of terrorism, and he links that with issues to do with immigration. Rightly or wrongly, what essentially he is doing is prioritizing certain measures for dealing with crises based on his ideological and political preferences. So, political preferences and ideologies cannot be removed from something as instrumental as crisis management. Some of us may think the act of crisis management is a technical exercise, an exercise that follows almost like a manual like approach to dealing with a problem. But in reality, within political systems, the crisis management process is saturated by political issues and intentions. And that's something to think about because really, when you're watching the news and you're looking at what's happened in the country or in our world in recent times, often what you'll see is politicians making speeches about it. You'll often have those in the emergency services having given talks or speaking to the press about certain things. And sometimes you have to think about the the act, if you like, of doing so, the ritual of dealing with crises. For example, politicians will often want to go to the site of where a crisis has happened to demonstrate empathy, to demonstrate politically that they're on your side. And they might be, but there's certainly an element of ritual associated with the politics of crisis management. If, for example, a politician didn't reach out to the people that were on the receiving end of a crisis, then it would be highly questionable. We've seen from the Grenfell Tower catastrophe in recent times that sometimes politicians don't always get that right. For example, Theresa May was criticised for her lack of empathy in a way for because she didn't meet with the victims of of the fire, but she met with the emergency services, and Jeremy Corbyn met with both. And I think the media really picked up on that and really thought that that potentially looked awkward politically. So politicians are scrutinised from beginning to end when it comes to the management of crisis. And within a 24-hour news world, within the pressures of social media, within the pressures of increased accountability for our political leaders, how you manage a crisis can have implications for your success as a politician, can have implications for how your government is viewed in terms of its level of competence. And this is something that we have to bear in mind in studying the politics of crisis management is the politics, the act, the understanding of politicians with regards to what's happened and how best to deal with problems. Even in so-called times of normality, public policy is complex. Public policy is surrounded by a web of issues. You think about anything on a day-to-day basis, and it could be things like how to tackle alcohol problems in Scotland. It could be to do with how to cope with things like inequalities in our society. It could be things like how to improve our transport infrastructure. These are all very different types of policies and policy areas, but they're quite complex in themselves because they involve a number of stakeholders, a number of actors who operate within different institutional contexts. And they might have different policy instruments or options at their disposal for dealing with a problem, or they might have a view on how best to tackle a problem. There might be the need for partnership working. There might be the need for stakeholders to work together. But that's not always an easy thing to do. It's easier to say things like that. Let's work in partnership. Let's build stakeholder relationships. But actually, it can be very, very difficult to do so because of silo working, different cultures in terms of how people work culturally. It might be to do with power dynamics. It might be to do with the fact that building trust and building relationships can take time and can be very complex. So normal policy making is complex, but you consider that in the context of crisis. Crises increase policy complexity because of the additional ingredients of threats, uncertainties, and levels of urgency, which do require policymakers to think carefully, even more carefully, about how they tackle problems. So crises can be like a pressure cooker in some ways for policymakers, in that they are surrounded by uncertainties and time is of the essence. You don't want to appear to be lackluster in terms of responding to a crisis. Given the fact that crises do have the potential to cause dismay, confusion, threat for societal actors, for individuals, for communities, it's very important that politicians recognise that and that they look in control of what they're trying to do. Now, that issue of looking in control is important because for any crisis manager, communication is a major important component of the exercise. You have to demonstrate that you're in charge. You have to demonstrate that you're on top of things. Otherwise, that can lead to disorder. And if there's one thing that governments do not want is disorder. So therefore, crises increase complexity because of the pressures of time, because of the level of scrutiny that's placed upon them. Therefore, they become very, very challenging. So for leaders, it's very important for them to manage the crisis effectively. That's because the popularity and electoral sustainability of governments can be related to how they cope with crises. Crises focus attention over what government does, how people behave. They become focusing events, more so than everyday politics, in the sense that crises call into question the pre existing way of doing things. Do we have to change what we do next as a government, as a society? Do our policies actually work? Do we have to learn lessons? Do we need to create change as a result of crises? Do we have to learn the lessons? One of the things that you will discover as a student of crisis management is that there's not always a direct relationship between learning and change. Governments can say, we will learn the lessons. We will learn the lessons of what went wrong. And that's there to reassure. And it could be well intentioned as well. However, the proof of the pudding is often whether that leads to change, actual change. So, policy change, organisational change, changes in political commitment, financing, resourcing, and so on. And there's not always a neat relationship between the two. So, for my own research, one of the things I've been interested in is the extent to which government, UK government, has learnt lessons from the 2001 foot and mouth crisis. Because the foot and mouth crisis back in 2001 was catastrophic for the agricultural sector, terrible for the tourism sector. It led to a number of problems for our society. And government, the Labour government at the time, said they would learn the lessons from the crisis, and they did. They learnt many lessons from the crisis, and that did translate into change at a kind of legislative level and organisational level. But there was things that they didn't change. For example, intelligence gathering in terms of how diseases spread across the country. And if you don't have that intelligence, that undermines your entire lesson learning exercise because you need data. Data informs decisions. And if you don't have the data, robust, adequate, and up to date data to inform your response to crises, therefore, that can lead to further vulnerabilities and calls into question the learning exercise at all. So, often what happens is governments will learn the lessons and create some change, some political change. But then some things might not change, and that the things that might not change might be things that require significant resourcing and long-term political commitment. Now, long-term political commitments can be challenging because governments often work to parliamentary cycles. In the UK, we have a 5-year parliamentary cycle, and if you're trying to deal with a chronic issue or problem that has, say, 20, 30-year timelines attached to them, the parliamentary cycle can cause problems for you. It might mean that policies and investment and contingency planning and trying to reduce risk in the long term might be left wanting because of short term political ambitions. So that's something that to bear in mind when you're thinking about long term leadership to create and build capacity for crisis management. To what extent do electoral cycles and parliamentary terms have an impact on such things? The literature talks about crises in different ways, and there's different ways to define crises. Quarantelli has written about this idea of crises as a process, in the sense that there are relationships that we see in crises that connect with each other. The characteristics of the phenomena, the conditions that lead to them, and the consequences that result. So a crisis isn't just one thing. A crisis could be an event that does focus our attention, but that event emerges from something. It emerges from a pre existing order or a lack of investment or a vulnerability that was unforeseen. And therefore, the event happens, governments want to learn lessons from them. Whether or not they learn lessons or not, the crisis will have implications. There'll be consequences. For every action, there's an outcome. And for crisis managers, a key task is to manage those consequences. So that might be things like learning lessons and creating change. But what is clear from our knowledge of public policy is that policies often sustain over time. It's quite difficult to radically change direction in public policy. So the outcomes of crises could be said to be similar in that the policy path that governments seek to pursue after a crisis might have long term implications. But taken as a whole, crises can be seen as a process. The characteristics of the phenomena, the conditions that actually lead to them, and the consequences that result. But also, crises can be dynamic, they can be chaotic, they can flare up, they can flare down, they can be framed in different ways by different political actors. The media might frame a problem different from the general public. Different political parties might view crises in different senses as well. So we can see that, for example, with the global financial crisis. The UK Tory government suggested that the financial crisis was caused by Labour Party, the Labour government's economic policy, whereas at the same time, the Labour government suggested it was actually more of a global problem. So you can see the politics there, but that's important because that leads to a level of dynamism as to how we might view crises. So crises are often not just one thing that happens and then that's it. It's often related to pre-crisis conditions and what happens after. You'll see in the academic literature there are numerous ways to categorise crises, and these are known as crisis typologies. For example, the literature talks about crises being sudden, so they might happen very quickly and seem very sudden. You have crises that might be creeping, creeping over time, that it could be a sense of vulnerability has been there for a while, but actually, we might have been aware of it, but not quite seen the full outcomes of them until the crisis happens. So things like climate change is a good example of a creeping crisis. We all are quite aware of the debates around the climate and the risks that that brings in terms of natural disasters and so on. But there's definitely a creeping issue that keeps creeping away, and we see the outcomes of it quite clearly when something happens, when a crisis happens. But then there's other ways to categorise crises. It could be natural, they could be man-made crises, they could be fast-burning crises, they could be unexpected. Are crises accidental, cathartic, slow-burning, long shadow? In other words, do they cast a long shadow over politicians for a number of years? If you're in the camp that thinks that Brexit is a crisis, then Brexit will certainly cast a long shadow over the economy for a period of time anyway. But obviously, there's those on the other side of the argument that suggest that actually crises will open up, if Brexit as a crisis would open up windows of opportunity for change. It depends on the argument. It depends on what side of the argument you come down on. But essentially, you could categorise Brexit in different ways. It could be seen as a political crisis. It could be seen as an economic crisis, social crisis. It just depends on your interpretation. Of course, there's other ways to categorise crises as well. For example, it could be regarded as ill-structured messes. That's what Mitroff and his colleagues suggest. They could be modern. Now, when we talk about modern crisis management, essentially we're also talking about things that are transboundary, and that's on the slide as well. This idea of interconnectivity, interconnections that are brought about as a result of globalization. And when we talk about modern, we're really talking about that interconnection in terms of technology, free movement of goods and services, what we kind of regard as the hallmarks of a modern economy, the interconnections that we see. So some actors or some academics talk about cyber terror as a good example of a modern crisis. Cyber terror happens because of the modern technology that we have and the limitations of that technology, or the extent to which that technology can be manipulated and lead to crises. And of course, international as well. Now, that's the main focus of our module in terms of the global governance, the international implications of crisis management. So, it really does depend on the nature of your study as to how you would categorise a crisis. It depends on the case study that you're interested in exploring. And it's really understandable that folk frame crises in different ways because every crisis has its own context, its own social, political, and economic context to deal with. And that might lead you to define that particular crisis in a certain way to reflect that context. Okay. So, what we can say though is that crises are associated with uncertainty, threat, ambiguity, risk, and these are important features of the decision making process, or at least these are things that shape crisis decision making or surround crisis decision making. These ideas of uncertainty, threat, ambiguity, and risk. Some of you might be wondering, well, what does the literature say about the difference between crises and disasters? It's a good question because they're often two sides of the same coin. Both crises and disasters often lead policymakers to question the status quo and to think about, what lessons have to be learned and what we could do to prevent a crisis or disaster happening again, like in the future. So, Alexander talks about the idea of a definitional minefield in this area, and it's true. There certainly is a definitional minefield. Um, the different academics have written different things in this context. For example, Parr has talked about disasters of leading to a lack of protection, and he talks about cultural protections. Rubin and Popkin talk about unique events. Barton talks about disasters as being collective forms of stress. They might be systemic events. So they call into question the state of affairs within a government, within a country, within a society. But at the same time, disasters are also very much associated with natural events, which lead to large scale damage to human life, damage to the physical environment, and have vast economic and social costs. Crises, on the other hand, can be associated with similar things. They tend to be more about public policy issues, tend to be more about the actions of government or the inactions of government. So crises are more political in a sense. Disasters tend to be associated with things that have more physical implications to them, damage to human life, damage to the environment, and so on. So, human vulnerabilities have been important when it comes to defining whether an event is a crisis or a disaster. But it is fair to say that crises and disasters are essentially from the branches of the same tree. One of the things that is important to bear in mind is the labelling of events. So it might be that something's called an accident, something could be called a disaster, something could be called a crisis, something could be called a hazard. There's so many ways in which you might define this state of uncertainty. And that can lead to an element of interpretive fuzziness, if you like. But as social scientists, as political scientists, I think we're quite used to that. We're quite used to conceptual issues not being always clear. It all comes down to the definitions that you seek to look at. All comes down to how you might want to frame a particular study. So Perry talks about this idea that actors create a definition with different ends in mind. So what that means really for you is that when it comes to your assignment, you might decide that actually you're going to look at a disaster, but look at it from a crisis management lens. So what's the politics? What's the global and political issues that surround your disaster? It's absolutely fine to study a disaster, if you like, but look at it from a global governance and crisis management perspective. So it's really for you to obviously working with me and to talk to me and communicate with me about what it is you're seeking to do. And we can talk through these issues when it comes to your assignment planning. But it's important to bear in mind that there is an element of conceptual fuzziness, but that's okay. Don't get worried about that. That's the reality of the complexity of the world in which we inhabit. The discipline itself does have a knack of having conceptual crossovers to them. And I think that's important to bear in mind that that ambiguity is something that is okay. It gives us the tools and mechanisms to dovetail what our ideas might be to a particular case study. And it gives us an element of creative freedom, if you like, in pursuing this topic of global crisis management. One of the things that you will know from your studies of politics is the importance of framing, defining situations, and that problems are framed and defined with different ideas in mind. They could be affected by ideologies and discourse. And like I've hinted at before, this issue of defining what is the wicked problem, what is the issue you're trying to address, is saturated by political interests, which are created out of things like traditions, cultures, attitudes, beliefs, and so on. We know that things like the crises of inequalities in our world can be defined in different ways. Some look at it in terms of the issues to do with capitalism and the vast gulf between those that have and have not as a result of that economic system. Whereas others might say, well, actually, it's more about a political problem. It's less to do with the economy. It's to do with political interests. Are they two sides of the same coin? Quite probably. It might be that those on the receiving end of inequality, those that might have, for example, lost their job due to global forces and global market forces, might actually regard that state of affairs as something that's been intentioned by neoliberal political actors. It depends on where you view things. Often where you stand on this issue is where you sit. Are you affected directly by a crisis? That might give you a different form of interpretation as to what the problem is. For example, the Grenfell Tower um, catastrophe, like we've talked about already, that really called into question the political commitment for dealing with those living in relative poverty and the issues to do with the long term political commitments of coping with that and dealing with it and addressing it. So there's been a number of different political commentators discussing that issue. So is the Grenfell Tower, can that be defined as an accident? Can it be defined as a disaster? Can it be seen as a political problem? Can it be seen as a crisis of inequality? So there's these different important reference points and terms and frames that have real implications because they have implications for how societal actors regard that issue, but also potentially with regards to how policymakers might decide to address the issue, what policies they might incorporate to cope with the problem in the future. Do they invest more in housing? Do they invest more on poverty reduction? Do they invest more in social mobility? So these things are very important to think about in the framing of these issues. And of course, the forces of subjectivity cannot be removed here. Similar to notions about judging if something can be seen as a success or failure, for example, a policy to tackle homelessness, for example, you know, can you regard that as a success or failure? It can be quite difficult to come up with a solid answer to that question. It's often difficult to apply fixed criteria to moving problems, complex issues. And this is certainly an issue when it comes to studying crisis management. But again, crises can open up windows of opportunity for policymakers in many respects. A good example of this is from my own research is looking at the 2007 outbreak of foot and mouth in the UK, 6 years after the resolution of the previous crisis in the early 2000s. And Tony Blair had recently handed over the premiership to Gordon Brown. And in many ways, this outbreak of foot and mouth in 2007 was a real test for Gordon Brown, a real test for his leadership when he came into power. And it was positive. He dealt with the crisis really well. And some commentators thought that he could make real capital out of that, in the sense that he can demonstrate that he's a solid pair of hands, that he's a good crisis management leader. It just so happened that the outbreak itself was more regional than the previous one. The previous one was very much a national crisis. However, he did win plaudits for his effectiveness in coping with that crisis. So there could be windows of opportunity for your own purposes as a political leader in terms of demonstrating competence. On the other hand, there can be other ways to think about opportunity windows in a political sense. So the global financial crisis that we saw, that also known as the credit crunch, led to a number of national public policies advanced by the post 2010 Conservative and Liberal Democrat government around things like welfare reform as a way to try and get the public finances back on track as they regarded it. You could look at it from another point of view, which is say, well, actually, that crisis led to a window of opportunity for the government to pursue neoliberal policies that they might have struggled to do in any other normal circumstance. So to win an election by saying you're going to implement a series of welfare reforms and deficit reduction at any normal time could be very difficult to win an election based on that. But given the fact that they had the backdrop of the global financial crisis to say, look, we don't want this crisis to happen again. We're vulnerable for another crisis like this happening unless we get the public finances back on track. Therefore, that can make the UK government say that they are doing things in the national interest. Now, you may agree with that, and that might be the case. But certainly, the global financial crisis opened up that window of opportunity for that to come onto the table. So, crises are not always negative politically, they are challenging, but they can, depending on their nature, produce windows of opportunity to advance political change, depending on what you seek to do as a political actor and depending on how much power you have. And of course, it can be difficult to generalise as to whether or not change is going to happen. We've talked about this previously, but it's useful to restate this point that, if we think of something like an airline crash, that invokes a real sense of urgency. It calls for drastic change and a significant response. But whereas a crisis in the NHS, for example, which was seen in 2018, and the aftermath of Christmas and into the New Year period in England, particularly, um, these issues can be very incremental and more slow burning, and they might not necessarily have the swiftness of a governmental response that you might see, for example, when it comes to something like an airline crash or a train crash or something like that. So it's important to remember the nature of crises do differ considerably, and often there's not always a neat relationship between a crisis and the level of political commitment to change the way we do things. So, some key points to draw out from this. Crises are associated with words such as urgency, threat, risk, uncertainty. There are many definitions and typologies of crisis. However, crises tend to threaten values, norms, tend to severely call into question the performance of policymakers and institutions. Political framing is very important as well as who does the framing. Crises are underpinned by politics, and policymakers may exploit a crisis or crises can be seen as having functional purposes in political terms. So there are the adverse things that come from a crisis, but they can also produce opportunity windows as well at a political level. For this part of the online lecture, I just want to say a few things about how global crisis management relate to the core concepts in political science. As you can see from the slide there, these terms I'm sure will be familiar to you if you've studied the social sciences and politics particularly. Um, these terms are very, very much associated with global crisis management. So if you think about authority, the discharge of authority, the ability to govern, having the authority to implement change, to deal with problems, to implement things. This is very much a key part of understanding global crisis management. Who has the authority to cope with crises that have multi jurisdictional implications to them? Where does the authority fall when you're dealing with complex policies that cross cut policy areas as well? So, when is it appropriate, for example, to be the leading crisis actor? If you think of the United Nations, for example, they're involved in a number of different crises, crisis management activities. It might be within conflict areas, it might be to do with things like civil society development, and so on. But then so are other organisations such as the World Health Organization. They might be involved from a health point of view, or it might be that non-governmental organisations, NGOs, say the Red Cross or UNICEF, they might be involved in a number of different areas too. And who takes the lead? And quite oftentimes that can be unclear when a significant crisis occurs. So, questions of authority: who has the authority and why? That's something that I want you to think about when it comes to looking at the case studies that you will see in the module, but also when it comes to the assignment. Legitimacy is also important. Who gives organisations, global organisations, the legitimacy to do things, to be the crisis actor, to manage crises. Who gives the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, their legitimacy? Well, you could say it's nation states that give it that authority and legitimacy, given the fact that authority and legitimacy are closely linked here, because you don't have much authority if you don't have the legitimacy to do so. But legitimacy is very important because it might often come from the electorate. The electorate might decide that you have, as a government, the legitimacy to carry out actions to cope with crises. So we're talking before about the global financial crisis and the advent of the Conservative Liberal Democrat government in 2010 that was really there to try and, as they said, work in the national interest to cope with the after effects of the global financial crisis. Now, the coalition government sought its legitimacy in some way from the country in terms of public support. And the electoral decision of electing a government to take that forward could be regarded as an act of ensuring legitimacy. Now, the question, obviously, that relates to is how that's done. And oftentimes, our electoral system can produce uncertainties as to who really has the authority and who has the legitimacy. For example, our present government relies on the UPE to maintain its authority within Parliament. It doesn't have a clear overall majority. That could, in some regard, lead to questions about legitimacy of a strong government, for example. So these these terms are heavily associated with politics, but not just politics, but whether or not governments, international organisations have a license, if you like, to cope with crises. Just like anything in politics, power is extremely important, and the discharge of that power, the extent to which the power that you have is used effectively as a global actor in resolving a crisis. To what extent do you have enough power? To what extent do nation states have to give global actors more power to deal with chronic problems? That could be to do with the environment. It could be to do with climate change and so on. So power is something that relates very much to your decision-making capacity and the resources you have to undertake the act of crisis management. Who gives you that power? How do you ensure that that power is held up for scrutiny? And that leads to questions to do with accountability. How do you ensure that in a world of global governance, that international organisations are held to account, given the fact that they're often at the top of the tree in many ways globally? And how do you ensure that the integrity of the branches of that tree are held up to scrutiny in the best way? So what are the mechanisms, the democratic mechanisms for doing so? And that takes us to democracy. Democracy might be to do with accountability here, but it might also be to do with who's involved in crisis management. Who feeds in to pre-crisis management activities? Who helps when it comes to resolving crises? Do global actors, do states, do they open up the corridors of power to a number of different actors to feed into the process? To what extent is society at large involved in working with global governance actors in the preparation for dealing with crises? To what extent are victims, those on the receiving end of crises, involved in decision making? These are democratic questions. So, inclusivity and decentralisation, engagement, all of these terms are heavily associated with crisis management, but essentially what they are democratic questions. Ideology, we've already talked about how ideas shape and frame how things are dealt with and how problems are resourced or how they are addressed and so on, or perhaps not addressed. Ideology is essentially about sets of ideas that lead us to look at society in a particular way, based on your understanding of how society operates. Therefore, ideology might shape whether or not global crisis management is something that will be invested in and something that happens. Or is it the case that if you think of a more state centric perception of the world, whereby it's actually states themselves that are most important, it might be that your ideology leads you to become more protectionist in how you view the world. That doesn't always lend itself to global cooperation, a globalized approach for dealing with crises. So protectionism can have implications, if you like, for the order of global governance and whether or not global issues are tackled in the most appropriate way. And governance is key here. Global governance is something I've been talking about, and governance as a term is really about relationships. It's about relationships, it's about how governments, how global actors operate and relate to different organizations. They could be governmental, but they could also be non governmental. And how do you work together in the most. Global governance refers to the ways in which a variety of actors come together to address global problems. Mark Bever suggests that historically states have been regarded as the principal actors in producing global governance. Recently, however, social scientists have drawn attention to the increasing prominence of multinational corporations and non governmental organisations in global governance. Global governance is a slippery concept in many ways, but it refers to the dispersal of power and decision making across multiple horizontal and vertical levels of the state. It also leads to questions about whether decision making is state centric or whether it can be better categorised as a fluid and multi directional process involving partnerships and networks of societal actors across sectors. So, like I said, this is really about relationships, power relationships, how different actors work together horizontally, vertically, whether or not states relate well to global actors, whether or not global actors relate well to states, and also other actors too, like industry, multinationals. So, how does all that come together? What does that look like? That's really the study of global governance, understanding the patchwork, the behaviours, the dynamics, the environment of actors operating within a global context. And there are questions about whether crises lead to the dispersal of power or the concentration of power. Hartz and colleagues have discussed this idea of the centralisation thesis. So, when a crisis happens, does a government decide to become the most powerful actor and take a very government centric approach to the management of crises? Or do they engage more widely? Do they decentralise? Do they have more of a what I call a resilience orientation in their approach? Resilience really gets us to think about the devolution of power, the devolution of responsibility to a number of different actors when it comes to dealing with a crisis. Quarantelli talks about this idea of command structures, and he talks about the fact that looser command structures are needed to facilitate accurate information which can be communicated quickly. So this does represent a dilemma for crisis managers, since this poses the following question: who should be involved in responding to crises? Is it a bottom up or top down affair? Well, how should it look? And that really gets us to think about the role of states as well. So it does get us to think about how states approach global actors. Do they defer to global actors when it comes to the management of crises? Are global actors strong enough? For example, is the European Union strong enough when it comes to tackling crises? When it comes to things like chronic issues like inequality, when it comes to things like civil society development, conflict? How does the EU operate as an international actor? It's not just about what happens with its member states, but how does it relate to states beyond the European Union? And how does that play out? There's been more recent studies of the EU as a crisis management actor, and it's clear that the EU has developed competencies over the years through the European integration process to take on more crisis management roles. But there's questions in the literature about whether or not they are sufficient or not. Brexit, for example, has led to questions about what crisis management activities will look like for Britain, for the UK, in a post Brexit world, because the work that the UK were involved in from a crisis management point of view were often related to our involvement in the single market. And does that mean that the patterns of crisis management are now subject to change because of Brexit? The UK were often key experts, if you like, in the management of certain crises. I know from my own research that the expert capacity, the scientific capacity that exists within the UK is second to none when it comes to dealing with health security issues. So that advice that the European Union has benefited from for a considerable amount of time, will that change? Will our experts in the UK still have a role? Will they still have a seat at the table in the EU after Brexit? So there's questions around that at the moment. And now, of course, again, that goes back to this issue of relationships. Relationships as how we understand governance. And Brexit gets us to think about that in a slightly different way. There's also this issue of systems perspectives. We can look at the more industrial views of crisis management to help us out here in thinking about systems perspectives. So there's a literature on critical infrastructures that talks about the complexities of modern systems. And what you'll find in that literature is that there's almost an inevitability of failure within complex modern systems. And that's also been documented within the policy literature as well, in that it's very inevitable that failure happens in public policy, that the risk of that will increase if relationships are very tight. Perel, for example, talks about this idea of normal accidents, and he illustrates the conception of complexity and what he calls tight coupling, in that organizational systems that are complex and interactive, such as, for example, nuclear plants or aircraft systems, mean that small errors in a system can interact in unforeseen ways in the system that can lead to large scale change and they can cascade across the system. So if we think about that and translate that to governance, we can talk about the interconnections of systems, governmental systems, as a result of globalization, as a result of integration, say, for example, with the EU. Therefore, does that increase levels of failure or the risk of failure as a result of this governance type coupling in some ways? So that gets us to think about, again, the forces of globalization. We can see quite recently with the cyber terror issues that we saw, well, the cyber crisis in the NHS in England, whereby in 2017 there was quite a considerable amount of attacks, cyber attacks, on the NHS system in England. Some systems in Scotland were affected, but it was mostly within the NHS in England. That wouldn't have happened without globalisation. That wouldn't have happened without interconnection of information systems. But also the kind of wider political issues around the Trump administration and the involvement of the Russians, if you like, in manipulating the electoral outcome. Now, obviously, that's an ongoing issue and an ongoing battle, if you like, for the Trump administration. But the fact that that can happen at all is a demonstration, if you like, of interconnection, for good or ill in many ways. And again, let's not forget framing. Very, very important in this study of global crisis management. And that gets us to think also about symbolism, the use of language, political language in crisis management. Governments often make use of rhetorical devices during crisis periods to legitimise their authority and communicate to the masses that something is being done. And in fact, Lee Clark, 1999, he talks about this idea of the symbolic nature of documentation, in that contingency plans themselves that are published by governments are no more than fantasy documentation. In other words, that governmental efforts to try and tame crises by having a document that details that one actor will do this in this event, and that event will prompt another action by another agency, and so on, in a very kind of instrumental, almost technical manner. For Clark, that doesn't actually cater for the unknowns, the complexities that crises bring, and also the individual nature that crises have, because no crisis is the same. And documentation also doesn't always address the human capacity issue, human error issues that surround crises. So symbolism is quite important when it comes to having a plan. Having a plan can look like you're doing a good job and that you're preparing for a crisis, but the question is always, to what extent does that contingency plan match up to the complexities and the realities of a crisis that actually unfolds? One of the famous writers on symbolic politics is someone called Murray Edelman, who wrote that every administration finds it politically useful to claim that its policies are working. There is, accordingly, a systematic deflation in governmental rhetoric of the developments that call attention to the unequal distribution of goods or services, and the systematic inflation of the forms of threat that legitimize and expand authority. The latter are defined as crises and the former as problems. As crises recur and problems persist, so does a governmental dramaturgy of coping. So the use of rhetoric language in defining a problem versus a crisis is very important if you're a policymaker, because it will call for you to do different things depending on how you define the event itself. So let's not forget this issue of framing. No matter what session you come across in this module, be it about migration, be about health, could be about democracy, could be about dementia, could be about a number of different things. Always think to yourself, how is this crisis framed, and who is framing it, and for what purpose? And consider the roles of powerful states and non-state actors in shaping the framing and shaping the policy and governmental agenda. So really, when we're talking about framing, we're talking about a way of selecting, organising, interpreting and making sense of a complex reality so as to provide guideposts for knowing, analysing, persuading and acting. Right, we have a summary. It's just important to highlight here that there are many ways in which notions of crisis are linked to key concepts in political science. Some of these concepts are linked, for example, authority, legitimacy, power, democracy, ideology. However, the crisis lens can give us insights into each of these, and equally, the politics of crisis management cross-cuts these concepts. Systems and governance perspectives can help us understand the complexities of crisis management processes. There are a number of literature sources that elaborate on the content of this online lecture. Feel free to read through the material at your leisure, and this will help you very much to embed your learning on this topic. We will also discuss the themes from this session um, in due course throughout the rest of the module. Again, just some further sources of information here for you. I look forward to discussing the reading with you in class in due course, and I hope you very much enjoy this module. Thank you.